Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we're back for another episode of Libertarian and Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have West Virginia National Guard to deploy to DC for federal takeover from fox5dc.com, posted by Donald Key. And, yeah, personally, I don't really care that they're deploying the National Guard to, DC, but ultimately, the National Guard is ultimately going to be subject to whatever authority says to be subject. That's why I like to the system for the National Guard system. I would say when they were more unregulated militia rather than the National Guard that they are today. And yeah, personally, I think all this DC stuff's just kind of theater. He's putting it on the National Mall to just kind of look tough. But ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, it's all just theater. It's pretty much just WWE at this point. Trump's in the WWE Hall of Fame for a reason, and he's that's definitely important to remember as well. It's all just pretty much just theater like wrestling. And then we have secret White House spreadsheet ranks U.S. companies based on loyalty to Trump from Telegraph.co.uk, posted by Empty Row 5585. And yeah, personally, I don't think the government should have any databases at all, but ultimately the government can justify having whatever databases it wants to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And yeah, if they want to have a spreadsheet ranking companies on loyalty to Trump, they have the monopoly and use force just by having whatever databases they want to. I personally don't care for any government databases, but Social Security has been a thing for 90 years now, and that relies on a huge government database, and so has the census, and that's pretty much been here since the Constitution was put in place. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Braun wants to leave interracial marriage up to the states, posted by Paton13, and that's a cross post from the Indiana subreddit, and looks like a TikTok or something, a clip of Indiana Governor, I think Mike Braun, saying, GOP governor says interracial marriage should be left up to the states. And yeah, personally, I think this is just a Reddit rage bait, like pretty much everything on Reddit is these days. Interracial marriage is not going to be repealed anytime soon. And regardless, I think the libertarian perspective is to get the state out of marriage entirely, rather than have the state involved in marriage and determine who can get married and who can't. Personally, I think marriage is very much a religious and personal matter rather than a state matter, and I think that's very much a libertarian position. Then we have, I just had my midsection searched by TSA, posted by Caldwell Curmudgeon, and they said, so I'm flying home after a conference, first things first, went through the facial recognition checkpoint. Though you can opt out of this, they don't really give you the opportunity to. It happens alarmingly quickly. I walk up, hand my ID over, and then the guy says, look here, and half seconds later it's over. Then I go through the scanner, it shows me having a suspect object right on my genitals. Mind you, I'm in my gym shorts and underwear, nothing in my pockets, and no piercings to speak of. So I get the old up and down, side sweep, check of the groin, that's it. But I can't say I felt like I had any dignity. Although about the only thing I can think of is I took a piss right before going through. But it's still, if they're sending it off somehow, your shit sucks. Mind you, the TSA badge says respect on it. Can't say it felt particularly respectful. And I would agree with that. I think the TSA might be well-intentioned, but, ultimately, I don't think they're preventing too many terrorist attacks by how they're marketed as being such. And, yeah, if people want to have, if the government wants to enforce TSA, ultimately has the monopoly and legal force to enforce whatever it wants to. But I personally think, they're just more annoying than they are effective. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have the U.S. marches towards state capitalism with American characteristics from Lemon Limelight, and they said, from a Wall Street Journal column, a generation ago, conventional wisdom held that as China liberalized, its economy would come to resemble America's. Instead, capitalism in America is starting to look like China. Recent examples include President Trump's demand that Intel's chief executive resign, the 15% of certain chip sales of China that NVIDIA and Advanced Micro Devices will share with Washington, the golden share Washington will get in U.S. steel as a condition of Nippon Steel's takeover, and the $1.5 trillion of promised investment from trading partners Trump plans to personally direct. This isn't socialism, which is state owns the means of production. It's more like state capitalism, a hybrid between socialism and capitalism, in which the state guides the decisions of nominally private enterprises. China calls its hybrid socialism with Chinese characteristics. The U.S. hasn't gone as far as China, or even milder practitioners of state capitalism such as Russia, Brazil, and at times France. So call this variant state capitalism with American characteristics is still a sea change from the free market ethos that the U.S. once embodied. State capitalism means of political, not just economic control. Chinese leaders Xi Jinping ruthlessly deploys economic levers to crush any challenge to private party primacy. Trump has similarly deployed executive orders and regulatory powers against media companies, banks, law firms, and other companies he believes oppose him, who are rewarding executives who align themselves with his priorities. Trump is also seeking political control over agencies that have long operated at arm's length from the White House, such as the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Federal Reserve. That, too, is echoes of China, where the bureaucracy is fully subordinate to the ruling party. Trump has long admired the control he exercises over his country, but there are, in theory, limits to how far he can emulate him. American democracy constrains the state through an independent judiciary, free speech, due process, and the diffusion of power among multiple levels and branches of government. How far state capitalism ultimately displaces free market capitalism in the U.S. depends on how those checks and balances hold up. And I would agree with most of that. I think the U.S. has been more state capitalism than free market capitalism for a while now, at least since arguably FDR. But ultimately, I definitely do think that the government's increasingly being more open about it, and that's not something that I personally think is that libertarian. The libertarian position is not for crony capitalism, but for a true free market. And right now, with the government being as big and authoritarian as it is, it's much more big government and big business joined at the hip than anything else. And that's my thoughts then on that issue. Now we have Trump says he likes the idea of starting a war so he can cancel elections in 2028, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the No Shit Sherlock subreddit, and that looks like a clip from TikTok. Trump says and that was him talking to Zelensky saying, "Oh, you cancel elections during your war. Well, what if we cancel elections if we had a war?" And of course, I think that's kind of more Trump trying to call out Zelensky. When Zelensky does it, it's okay because Russia's invading. But when Trump does it, suddenly fascism, and that just goes to show you, Redditors have no standards other than Orange Man bad. That if the Russia ever invaded the U.S. and the president tried to cancel the elections, I'm sure that if it was Trump, Reddit would go, this is literal fascism. But if it was Joe Biden, Reddit would go, this is entirely justified. And that just goes to show you how, as I always say, most people when it comes to politics only have no values, only teams. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Dominion Voting System settles defamation lawsuit with Newsmax over 2020 election claims from WBAL.com, posted by MTRO5585. And personally, I think, everyone should have freedom of speech. If you want to say that Dominion rigged the 2020 election, you should be able to. And I think slander and libel, I don't think they're that honorable, but, I think they do fall under free speech. So that's my thoughts on that issue. A bunch of Redditors are saying that the 2024 election was rigged, and they're not going to face any consequence for it. So I don't know why Newsmax should face any consequence for saying the 2020 election was rigged. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have pedo protecting admin released Israel pedo rapist Alexandrovich back to Israel, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the Blue Sky Skeet subreddit, and that's a Blue Sky post from John Cooper, who said, "Holy shit," and that was him replying to a guy quoting a guy named Maine. Justin Trump administration directly released Israel's request to release Israeli cybersecurity official Tom Alexandrovich, charged with sex crimes and children, and give him safe passage to Israel. And that just goes to show you how, they're all pretty much, Reddit might say, oh, this is Trump being Israel's pocket, but, they're all pretty much in Israel's pocket with a few selected exceptions like Thomas Massey. And, you gotta call them out when they do this. And it's personally, ISIS is not something I care for, but ultimately the government can release anyone it wants to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Then we have Texas Republicans have locked out Democratic Rep. Nicole Collier inside the State House chamber and refused to allow her to leave until she signs a permission slip, posted by Donald K., and that's a cross-post from the Moss subreddit. And that's a tweet from No Life, Brian Tyler Cohen. This is 4 charities, and he's quoting people for the American way. Texas Republicans locked Democratic Rep. Nicole Collier inside the State House chamber and refused to allow her to leave. They're requiring Democrats to sign permission slips and have police escort in order to leave the chamber, and she refuses to sign it. And personally, I think this is all just theater, like most politics is these days. But, ultimately, I don't think it's going to be a good look for the GOP. But ultimately, if the parties were reversed, Reddit would say it's entirely justified or downplay it severely and remove all posts about it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Texas Democrat trapped in House chamber after defying GOP escort rule from Cron.com, posted by MTRO55885. And that's pretty much the same headline as the last one. And yeah, so we'll move right to the next one. Immigration attorney Matt Cameron proposes the big freeze, ice out ICE from polite society, from OpenSubstack.com, posted by CH for Locks, and that's crosspost from the law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't care for ICE. They're just another three-letter agency. But ultimately, the government has legal monopoly on the use of force to justify enforcing whatever it wants to. And if and ICE is ultimately part of that government monopoly on the use of force. So ultimately, I don't think they're getting rid of any of ICE anytime soon. But I think it's interesting how a lot of libertarian-leaning conservatives who hate stuff like the ATF or the FBI are suddenly completely fine with ICE because it's marketed as doing something that they like. In reality, ICE is far closer to the ATF or the FBI than it is the actual libertarian position. And we have Trump to Zelensky, during the war, you can't have elections. Let me just see, 3.5 years from now, if we happen to be in a war with somebody, no more elections. That's good. From CH4 Locks, and that's across from the military subreddit. And yeah, as I said in the previous post, I think Zelensky should be having elections even if his country is being invaded, because in the U.S. we have elections. We had an election during the Civil War, the World War I, World War II, and ultimately, I don't think war is a good thing to call off elections. I don't care for democracy in general. I think it's tyranny of the majority. But just because you're getting invaded doesn't mean that you can suddenly call off elections. And when Reddit calls Donald Trump out when he says, maybe we shouldn't have elections during war. But when Zelensky actually does it, it's completely justified. That just, Reddit only cares about who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group. I'm sure if Biden, as I said earlier, if Russia ever invaded the U.S. and Biden was president, he'd be completely justified in canceling the elections according to Reddit. But if Trump was president, it'd suddenly be the worst thing ever. Then we have porn censorship is going to destroy the entire internet, posted by from Mashable.com, posted by LegioX, and that's also from the technology subreddit. And yeah, personally, I would kind of agree with that. I don't really care for porn. I think it's just kind of gooner bait. But if I think, and I don't think kids should be looking at it, but and any government censorship control over the internet, I don't think is a net positive. I think the internet needs to be as free as possible from government control, and because the more government control over something you have, the easier and easier it is to go to censor stuff that goes against the official narrative, and that's not something I particularly care for. Then we have DC residents resist Trump's jackbooted thugs, and that's a YouTube video from Humanist Report, how brave DC residents are resisting Trump's tyrannical military occupation, as opposed by Narco Federation. They added, "This is what freedom looks like. This was the revolutionaries' visions. Remember, crossing Rubicon is a dire warning of what follows when troops occupy state's capital. America went from the redcoats are coming to occupy the capital for nationwide municipal occupations." And yeah, personally, I don't think it's as bad as, stuff like Reddit or the Humanist Report make it out to be when it comes to the National Guard in DC, but I definitely don't think it's a step in the right direction when it comes to the states being willing to use military against its own citizens. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Let's Talk About Trump Surrendering to Putin, and that's a YouTube video from Bella the Ranch, and that's posted by Mundane Image 13. And they added, "Putin played Trump, and Trump, along with MAGA, is too blind to or stupid to see it. Putin dictated foreign policy to Trump by telling him that Ukraine can join NATO, but Putin will allow the USA to enter into separate alliance with Ukraine that offers Articles like 5 protections. But here's the thing, if Ukraine simply joined NATO, they wouldn't need Article 5 protections, because they would have Article 5 protections. If we don't support Ukraine's fight for sovereignty, then Russia will not stop at Ukraine. They will simply wait a few years, lick the wounds, and start break out again." And yeah, I guess you can make the argument against appeasement, but I think it's interesting. Reddit suddenly hates peace negotiations because Orange Man is the one doing them, and Reddit, they always mark themselves as being very peaceful and dovish, but suddenly Orange Man says maybe we should end this endless war, and suddenly Reddit's like, no, that's fascism. And that just goes to show you, they don't care about anything other than Orange Man bad at this point. It's been that way he's pretty much since he first announced his campaign 3,717 days ago, and that was 2016 campaign, that is. And yeah, personally, Ukraine, you don't want this war to continue forever. You might have to make some concessions you don't like, but on Reddit, you're not allowed to say that. I think it's interesting how Reddit's always like, we need to end all the bloodshed in Gaza, but the bloodshed in Ukraine is completely justified because the narrative says so. And that just goes to show you how they does follow whatever the narrative is. They don't have any thoughts other than what they're told to think. I'm sure if the narrative was you need to jump off a bridge, they'd be off that bridge faster than you can say pretty much anything. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. And let's see if there's anything new. So looks like that's all the new posts on the subreddit since I checked them. And yeah, we're gonna wrap up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.